And now, a passage from Cuba and the United States by O. Cuba's propinquity and its highly strategic position in the Caribbean have inevitably produced an unusually intimate connection with the United States. It is the nature of this connection subsequently confirmed by formal arrangements and strengthened by economic penetration from the North, which the Cubans now find irksome and which they would alter so as to obtain greater freedom of movement. In addition to the fortuitous circumstance of geographical proximity, the brief 90 miles that separate the two countries, three outstanding factors affect the relations between Cuba and the United States. These are the Platt Amendment, the Reciprocity Treaty of 1903, and the large American investments in the island. The Platt Amendment, which was originally passed as a rider to an Army appropriation bill in the American Congress, was incorporated into the Cuban Constitution against the bitter opposition of most of the higher political class in Cuba. The circumstance that the island was still under the military government of the United States made its acceptance obligatory in the Cuban Constitutional Convention. Four of the provisions of the amendment seemed to the Cubans to limit the national sovereignty of their nascent republic. The first forbade the making of treaties with third powers which might compromise the independence of the nation. The second limited the debt contracting powers of the government to obligations within the scope of the ordinary revenues. The third provided for intervention by the United States to maintain orderly government and all its accessories. The fourth required the cession to the United States of sites for coaling or naval stations. The Treaty of Commercial Reciprocity between Cuba and the United States was signed December 11, 1902, and has governed the trade relations between the two countries ever since. The special concessions embodied in the treaty were specifically confirmed by the United States Tariff Act of 1917, at which time the reciprocity arrangement with Brazil was discontinued in accordance with the new tariff policy of this country. The Reciprocity Treaty admitted Cuban goods into the United States at a reduction of 20% from the regular tariff rates. Thus, Cuban sugar of 96 degrees polarization, the standard in the crude sugar market, pays a duty of 1.7648 cents per pound as against 2.206 for sugar of other countries. On the other hand, American goods imported into Cuba, with the exception of tobacco products, were granted reductions of from 20 to 40% from the Cuban schedules, the preferential rate being graduated according to the four classes into which American products are grouped for the purpose. The treaty also provided that no sugar, the product of any other foreign country, shall be admitted by treaty or convention into the United States while this convention is in force, at a lower rate of duty than that provided by the Tariff Act of the United States, approved July 24, 1897. Investments of American capital in Cuba have reached an aggregate of some $1.5 billion, our largest holdings in any foreign country except Canada. The largest single item is, of course, sugar, which accounts for over half the total. Approximately two-thirds of the entire output of sugar is produced by American-owned mills. American interests include the Great Cuba Cane Sugar Company, the Cuban American, the Punta Alegre, the Cuban Dominican, and the Cuba Company. The Cuba Cane places the value of its properties at over $86 million. The National City Bank, through a holding company known as the General Sugar Company, operates a number of important centrals. The American Sugar Refining Company owns the two fine mills, Cunagua and Jaronu. The United Fruit Company operates two huge centrals on the north coast of Oriente Province, which it feeds with cane from the vast hinterland of its own territory. The Hershey Chocolate interests own three centrals in Matanzas Province. Besides these, there are a number of lesser companies in the field. The Americans have an overwhelming control of the industry in the two eastern provinces of Camagüey and Oriente, where in the crop year 1926 to 27, American-owned centrals accounted for 15,049,087 bags, as against 3,470,270 bags for the Cuban-owned mills. American companies also control the situation in Matanzas province. Only in the important province of Santa Clara and in the western provinces of Habana and Pinar del Rio, where the industry is on the decline, do the Cubans hold the balance. Each of the larger American companies owns or controls by long-time leases from 100,000 to 660,000 acres of lands. The aggregate of such holdings is well over 5 million acres. Thousands of miles of private broad gauge railway lines also serve the American sugar properties. Other investments comprise government securities, railways, public utilities, banks, hotels, mineral deposits, manufacturing industries, and general agricultural lands. The foreign debt of Cuba, amounting to a total of about $89 million, is all held in the United States. The railway system of the eastern provinces, unified under the Cuba Company and operated as the Consolidated Railways, is American controlled. In the field of public utilities, the American Foreign Power Company owns the light and power business in nearly all the important towns of the island, including the Havana Electric Company. The Cuba Telephone Company, with its wires all over the Republic, is a subsidiary of the International Telephone and Telegraph Company. The Havana Dock Company is another American-owned utility. Among banks, the National City Bank of New York is a powerful factor in the financial life of the island and has over 20 branches scattered throughout the Republic. The First National Bank of Boston and the Chase National Bank of New York also operate directly in Cuba. A number of the largest hotels in Havana are owned in the United States, and the Bowman interests of New York are now investing more millions in a large amusement development as a further stimulus to the growing tourist trade between the United States and Cuba. The Bethlehem Steel Corporation and other interests hold large iron and manganese ore deposits in the province of Oriente. The American Portland Cement Company controls the cement manufacturing plant at Mariel and a number of industrial establishments in and near Havana, including substantial investments in the tobacco manufacturing industry, are American-owned. American interests are also a prominent factor in the tobacco growing industry of Pinar del Rio, and many American farmers are engaged in the production of fruits and vegetables for export, especially in the Isle of Pines and in the country closely tributary to the city of Havana. In fact, most of the vegetables shipped to American markets are grown by Americans. It will be seen from this summary how completely American capital and enterprise dominate the whole economic life of the country. The only important exceptions are the growing of sugar cane, in which Cubans still predominate, and the general mercantile business of the island, which is largely in the hands of Spaniards. The economic structure of few other independent countries is controlled to such an extent by a foreign people. It is in order at this point to review briefly the developments in Cuban-American relations as affected by the two fundamental acts which govern these relations. Under the operation of the Platt Amendment, there has been but one instance of formal intervention in Cuban affairs. In 1906, intervention was precipitated by the inability of the Estrada Palma administration to put down a serious revolt against the government. At the invitation of the Cuban president, Secretary of War Taft was sent to Cuba by President Roosevelt, where he took over the direction of Cuban affairs, supplanting the constituted authorities of the Republic. After a short period as provisional governor, Taft was succeeded by Charles Edward Magoon, who was in charge of the intervention until its termination in 1909. The mission of General Crowder, who was sent to Cuba in 1921 as special representative of President Harding, partook of much of the character of a forced intervention, but did not involve the suspension of the native government. The sending of General Crowder was prompted by the necessity of exercising a certain measure of control over the acts of the shifty Zayas government. As such, it was a mission of considerable delicacy, since General Crowder was dependent on the support which his actions would receive from the government at Washington, and not upon the high powers conferred under a regime of intervention. However, he was able to exercise strong pressure on the Zayas government for the acceptance of his recommendations for improving the administration of public affairs, so that his position as obligatory mentor to a particularly exasperating government had some very substantial results. It is well to remember that both under the formal intervention of 1906-9 and under the Crowder mission, as well as during the life of the American military government, 1898 to 1902, every solicitude was shown by those in charge of American affairs in the island for the rights and feelings of the native Cubans. In spite of the possibilities of the situation, a minimum of friction was engendered. On the other hand, incalculable benefits of a very positive nature were conferred on a young and yet undisciplined nation, which was gravely in need of disinterested guidance. It is safe to say that, except for the efforts of the noble Estrada Palma to start his people on the right road, none of Cuba's own national leaders before President Mercado deserves so much gratitude from the nation as did General Wood and General Crowder. Wood occupies a very high place in Cuban popular esteem, probably as much for his participation in the War of 1898 as for his constructive accomplishments as military governor of the island. The very solid work of Crowder, who only retired during this year as ambassador to Cuba, has yet to receive the recognition which it deserves. Beyond the regulation official farewells, his departure from Havana attracted much less attention than the sailing of any Cuban cabinet officer for a vacation in Europe. The United States has had no occasion to exercise the right conferred on it by the Platt Amendment to prevent the curtailment of Cuban independence by a third power, and any voluntary relinquishment of national sovereignty by treaty provided against in the amendment is of course highly unlikely. Neither has control of governmental expenditures in the interests of national solvency been the object of intervention, though much of the work of General Crowder lay in that field. In accordance with the authority derived from the amendment, the United States government selected Guantanamo Bay on the coast of Oriente Province as the site for a naval base. This location was admirably chosen, not only because of its commanding strategic position long ago emphasized by Captain Mahan, but also because its isolated location minimizes the possibility of friction with the native element in the country. The Isle of Pines had previously been rejected for this purpose. Moreover, the American claims to this large island, the determination of whose ownership was left by the Platt Amendment to future negotiations, has been definitely abandoned to the great satisfaction of Cuban nationalists. Under the Reciprocity Treaty, trade between Cuba and the United States has reached such proportions that Cuba now ranks among the major factors in the foreign commerce of the United States. In both exports and imports, she is ahead of every other Latin American country. In 1926, the United States exported to Cuba goods to the value of $160,500,000 and imported from Cuba sugar and other products valued at $250,600,000. In 1925, the respective figures for exports and imports were $198,700,000 and $261,700,000. In the former year, Cuba ranked 7th among American export markets and 5th as a source of American imports. Cuba is our first market for many important lines, including boots and shoes, and is our second market for flour and cotton cloth. In the first 21 and a half years in which the Reciprocity Treaty was in effect, Cuba exported to the United States merchandise to the value of $4,666,167,044, or virtually 80% of her total exports. During the same period, she imported from the United States goods to the value of $2,902,359,002, or slightly over 67% of all her imports. The Reciprocity Treaty has had little effect on the course of Cuban export trade. The percentage destined for the United States in the fiscal year 1902-3 being 80.6, or substantially the same as for the whole period in question. However, the proportion of Cuban sugar exported to the United States has decreased considerably since 1911, up to which time we took practically the entire Cuban output. The increase of Cuban sugar production beyond the needs of the United States and the development of large domestic sources of supply by the United States have been responsible for this decline in the relative proportions of Cuban sugars taken by this country. On the other hand, the tariff advantages granted to American goods have resulted in raising the percentage of Cuban imports from the United States from 41.1% of the total 1902-3 to 61.4% in 1926, which is, however, 14% less than in 1919, the peak year of American trade with Cuba. It is noteworthy that the latter is the lowest figure since pre-war days, and as such represents the strong tendency of the trade to return to its earlier channels. This is largely explainable by the predominance of the Spanish mercantile element in the business of the island. Reduced to the simplest terms, Cuba's foreign policy must be a matter of finding markets for her sugar, and very secondarily, for her tobacco. Everything else is but the frills and fireworks of diplomacy. The assertion of her national amour-propre as a sovereign state. She believes that the first and substantial object is no longer properly served by the Reciprocity Treaty. The second and sentimental phase of her international policy she declares grievously prejudiced by the Platt Amendment, therefore she would modify the one and abrogate the other. Agitation against the Platt Amendment is perennial in Cuba. Though much of this outcry against the act which limits the country's sovereignty is only for political effect at home, discontent with the amendment is undeniably very real. It is difficult to say how much of this opposition is in turn the result of persistent agitation and how much spontaneous popular feeling. A fervid organization known as the League Against the Platt Amendment does not allow public concern over the problem to flag, and the press keeps alive the issue in its columns. President Mercado is a declared opponent of the amendment, and his declaration at Baracoa in September to the effect that Cuba will make whatever treaties she pleases is indicative of this attitude. The present political regime in Cuba is essentially nationalistic. It resents the economic dependence on the United States into which Cuba has fallen through one circumstance or another. It refuses to recognize the fact that the advanced American economic penetration of the Republic is only the natural result of the attraction of a field that promised good returns on the investment of capital. That Cubans were unable or unwilling to supply the capital and enterprise necessary for this development of their country does not affect this essential fact. They only see their sugar industry dominated by Americans, their banking system controlled from the United States, and vast areas of the national territory held in latifundias by the foreigners. They believe that the advantages of the Reciprocity Treaty are no longer reciprocal, and that the original convention should be altered to meet the changed condition of the present, so that the balance of favors contemplated by the treaty may be restored. Even Luis Marino Perez, probably the clearest economic mind in Cuba, is convinced of the antiquated nature of the reciprocity arrangement. Cubans contend that the present American duty on sugar is inordinately high, approximately 80% when reduced to an ad valorem basis, and that it bears no relation to relative costs of producing sugar in Cuba and the United States. The reduction of this duty is the great desideratum of Cuban foreign policy. It is regarded as the only certain guarantee for the future prosperity of their too exuberant sugar industry. They recognize the political power of the beet sugar industry in the United States as the principal obstacle to the attainment of their wishes, and view with alarm the increasing sugar production of our overseas possessions. But for the latter, Cuba could market her entire output in the United States. In 1926, the United States consumed 5,671,000 tons of sugar. Of this, Cuba supplied 3,291,000 tons, or 58.03% of the total. Our domestic beet sugar industry supplied 873,000 tons, or 15.39%, and the cane industry of Louisiana only 70,000 tons. We consumed 618,000 tons of Hawaiian sugar, 460,000 tons of Puerto Rican, and 313,000 tons of Philippine sugar, or a total of 1,391,000 tons. Cuba resents particularly the free admission of Philippine sugar into the United States, which she contends is in violation of the clause of the Reciprocity Treaty quoted above. However, the legal basis of her claim, whereby she protests that the Philippines are foreign territory, is a weak one, since the United States Supreme Court has declared the international status of the Philippines to be that of American soil. The Cubans assert, with considerable justice, that in view of the far greater magnitude of American investments in the Cuban sugar industry, that industry is deserving of relatively more consideration in the American tariff than is the case at present.